I'm Ken Rockwell. Here are some tricks and secrets that I use with my Z50 II from Nikon. Now, this won't teach you to be a great photographer. It's going to teach you how to operate the camera well and find some of the tricky little hidden features that I like to use. If you want to learn how to take great pictures, go to kenrockwell.com and follow the links in my description and read my pages about how to take great pictures, because seeing the picture in the first place is the only hard thing in photography. Taking the picture is easy, and simply knowing how to wrench around a camera does not lead to good pictures. So if you're not happy with your pictures, go read that. If you want to know some tips and secrets I use with my Z50 II, then by all means, keep watching. First off, charging this little beast. This charges via USB-C, which is right here. There's your connector. There's a little dim orange LED, which isn't that obvious. I'd rather have something bigger on the back, but that's what it is. Hint, it may take several seconds for it to start charging for that little LED to come on. So don't plug it in and freak out when you don't see the LED come on. Just be patient, and it'll come on, and you should be good to go. Another hint, it'll only charge from a USB-C source. You need to use a USB-C to USB-C cable. If you've got older chargers with the old-fashioned larger rectangular USB-A socket and using a USB-A to USB-C cord, it's not going to charge. You also could use the optional external charger, although the only reason for that is if you want to charge two batteries at once, one in the camera, one externally. The viewfinder display, if for some reason your viewfinder is not working right or the screen doesn't come on, there's a button you probably didn't even know you had. You see this little button here? That dude there chooses either only use the LCD, only use the viewfinder, only let the viewfinder come on when your face is to the screen so you won't have a camera being light, say in the dark if you don't want to be seen, or automatically just select between the viewfinder and the rear screen, which is the way it normally defaults. So if it doesn't work the way you want it to work, just hit this button a few times until you get that to restore to however you would like it to be. To program what all these buttons do, for instance, these function buttons, I like to program this to depth of field preview and this to autofocus, but you can set them any way you like. To do that, we go to Menu, we go to the Custom Settings menu, which is the pencil. We go to F, Controls, and F2, Custom Controls, Shooting, and then we can select which control and then what it does. For lenses, I can't say this strongly enough. People write me owning like a half a dozen lenses. They schlep around with this camera. Don't do that. That destroys the whole purpose of having a beautiful little camera. All you want is this adorable little kit lens, about the size of a good-sized lens cap, weighs nothing. It's all plastic. Takes fantastic pictures, as you've seen in my review. Or if you haven't seen the review, go to kenrockwell.com and look in the description of this video to get that link if you'd like it. Works great. Nice thing is this little lens even collapses. This is how you shoot it. This you can make it smaller. It comes as a kit. You can get a 50 to 250 as part of that kit. Or personally, I prefer the 18 to 140 millimeter Z lens, which is more expensive, but the beauty is, presuming you need to go beyond 50 millimeters, let's face it, when you shoot every day as I do, you appreciate the fact that having to change lenses and carry a spare lens wastes pictures, because while you're sitting there trying to change your lenses and grab the other one and change the caps and everything, you've missed your shot. Having the 18 to 140, just with a twist of the wrist, gets you what you want. I would suggest that lens if you have this lusting for longer lenses. One problem with this is, as of this writing in December of 2024, Nikon makes no reasonably priced lens longer than 250 millimeters dedicated to the Z mount. The 100 to 400 is a wonderful lens, but it's $2,500. And I don't know if that really makes sense for a lot of people. They make some great lenses. The problem was, in the reasonably priced realm, that 50 to 250 is the best you're going to get. And also, Sony does not make any sub $1,000 long zoom lenses either for their cameras. Turning VR on or off, the camera has no built-in stabilization, but you do need a way to change the stabilization settings on your lens, but there's no switch on most of their lenses. So you have to go into the menus. You go into the photo shooting menu, go into the vibration reduction option, and that's where you can turn it on and off. For autofocus modes, this is basic with Nikon. Now, depending on how you want to get to the autofocus modes, I program my FN2 button to do that. Now I'm holding the FN2 button. The rear dial controls either manual or autofocus. AFA means autofocus automatic, which automatically selects between the AFS mode, which means single focus and lock for subjects that are not moving, or AFC, which means AF continuous, which means it continuously tracks whatever's going on in and out and in and out. Then the front dial would change. The way in which it uses its multiple AF sensors. The only two settings I use is this, which is all area, which means it automatically will select which autofocus area to use, and it's usually pretty good, much better than the earlier cameras. Or 3D. in which case you see that one there? It's now going to track it all over the frame. Here's another pro tip. Instead of trying to move that sensor around with your little clickers here, don't bother. That's a pain. All you got to do is point it at, say, my mic stand, whatever it is, then recompose your picture. You see how it magically is moving for me. It's much easier. I want to take my finger off the shutter, boom, recess to the center, focus on whatever I want, and there I go. The camera has numerous autofocus area selection modes. I've disabled all of them that I don't use. And the way I do that is going into the custom settings menu, which is the pencil icon. Go to A, autofocus, A8, limit AF area mode selections, and you'll see I have everything unchecked. Now, I no longer use single point AF because I prefer to use the 3D tracking single point AF, as I showed you just a moment ago, but I can't uncheck that. But I've unchecked everything else other than the auto area AF and 3D tracking. All this other stuff, by all means, we're all different. Use what you want to use. I disable them all, so that way, when I press my FN button, I only have 2 or 3 selections, and I can get to the ones I need faster. I don't have to go through 6 or 7 of them to get to the one I want. I don't use rear button autofocus, but it seems like a lot of people do. In other words, instead of having it focus when I tap the shutter button, they want to tap, say, typically the AF lock button. We do that in custom settings menu, A for autofocus, then A6 for AF activation, and you would turn that to AF on only, meaning when you press the AF on button, that's the only time it'll focus. And then here's the other trick. You now have to assign which button you want to be the AF on button, because notice there's nothing marked that way. I like the AF button here, but you can set it to any button you want to do your focusing for you, which means we go into F controls, F2 custom controls shooting, and then assign whatever you want to be AF on. Here's maybe the most important point of this little video on how to use the Z50 II, is when I shoot, I set everything that I can to automatic. Now, I don't use this automatic setting because that locks out a lot of things so you can't make mistakes for very basic shooting, and a lot of the menu options I'm going to discuss or have discussed you can't get to. But I'll set it to program automatic, and then I set ISO, white balance, and everything I possibly can, including the slowest shutter speed and auto ISO, to their automatic settings. When you do that, the only thing you really need to worry about as your subject changes is as your subject motion increases or decreases, or camera motion increases or decreases. The one setting you need to set, and this is a little bit abstract, but since the camera is setting ISO, shutter speed, and ISO all automatically, the only thing that really matters is the slowest shutter speed below which you're going to start to get a blurry picture, either from your own handshake or from the subject moving too fast. And the way we set that is we go to the ISO settings, and then hidden down here is the minimum shutter speed. And that's the shutter speed below which, as the light gets dimmer, the camera enforces the fact that it will not let the shutter speed go slower than this unless you run out of ISOs. For things that hold still, and the problem is hand motion, I go to auto, and I'll set it to -2, assuming that I have a vibration reduction lens. And that gives me those, say, 1/6 of a second shutter speeds that at least I am perfectly capable of hand holding the camera with VR. For sports, I may set a 2,000th or a 1,000th. And again, I'll set these by whatever the sport is, and it's not a mystery. Look at the playback images, see what's sharp, use that shutter speed. For portraiture and people posing and so forth, I use about a 1/25th, because a 1/25th is sufficient to stop people who are just standing there and talking and moving around a little bit, but not actually trying to run around. And the reason you want to choose the slowest speed you can that does not give you any sort of blur is because the slower that shutter speed, then the lower the ISO can go and the sharper your picture will be. You see how we're balancing all these different factors. You're balancing subject motion, camera motion, as well as the blurring that I've already shown you, at least in my camera reviews. See kenrockwell.com or kenrockwell.tv for those samples where the camera starts making the image softer as the ISO goes up. So by choosing the slowest minimum possible shutter speed and auto ISO, you are now set up to get the sharpest possible pictures in every condition from moonlight to daylight. There's no bracketing button, but better than that, in the photo shooting menu, we have got all kinds of bracketing. You want to go in the photo shooting menu, look for the auto bracketing setting. And inside this, you'll see there's several different kinds of things you can bracket. You can vary exposure or white balance or whatever you like, and here's how you set it. Auto white balance. Oh my gosh, there's 4 kinds of auto white balance. Look at my written guides at kenrockwell.com, and links in the description. I'll show you examples of all this. But we set white balance typically by pressing this, the I button, and then the rear dial will select what kind of white balance overall. It defaults to A1. the front dial is selecting these 3 modes. It's weird. Keep white, reduce warm colors. That means even if you're shooting in very dim light indoors, it should look orange. It'll still come out looking white. A1, I find, gives the best overall results. And set to A2, it'll keep warm things looking really warm. And oddly enough, this other auto white balance setting, which is called natural light auto, this is optimized if you're shooting not under artificial lights, as I have here in my studio, but if you're shooting only lit by daylight or window light or shade or cloudiness, it optimizes itself to give much better results. And again, take a look at the written reviews and you can see examples of all this. But in general, usually shoot everything at A1, Auto 1, if you don't really know what any of this means. And if you want to change how the warm colors look, go to A0 or A2 to change how warm colors look under tungsten light indoors. And if you're outside, especially in shade, then use a natural light auto setting. Here's another important one. The camera, and all the Nikon digitals since the very first D1 of 1999 have had ways to set this. The camera is very smart, and it can optimize its contrast and dynamic range to suit the subject you're photographing. Oddly, Nikon disabled this by default, but the way we get to that is we go to the photo shooting menu, and we set active D-lighting, which of course makes absolutely no sense. But that's why you're watching this video. Here we go, active D-lighting. And I set mine to auto, which means that the camera will automatically figure out what's going on because the camera automatically is looking at the live image, figuring out what its dynamic range is, and automatically optimizing all of its processing to get all that dynamic range in each and every one of your photos. It'll actually vary the camera sensitivity as well as vary the exposure. It'll drop the exposure a little bit if the highlights were going to get blown out, and increase its sensitivity in the shadows if it needs to. Trust me, works great, although it's not on by default. To get to 15 or 30 frames per second, here's our various settings. Now, when you're in the H extended mode here, it'll go up to 15 frames per second with the electronic shutter. I'm going to show you how to get the electronic soon. If you just go to 15 or 30, that shoots at 15 or 30 frames per second. The gotcha is with C15 and C30, it locks out a lot of the settings, as I covered in my review. You can only shoot in JPEG large normal. You can't shoot RAW, and there's a lot of other things you can't do because it's actually reassigned a lot of the camera's memory to serve as a much larger frame buffer, and therefore it limits the processing that the camera can do. So if you want to shoot it up to 15 frames per second, I'd use that H extended mode with the silent shutter. And again, I have a lot more detail in the written user's guide, kenrockwell.com, and just follow the link in the description if you need to. Here's the shutter modes. Most of the time, we find the shutter mode by going to the custom settings menu. And it's funny how they hit it here. They hit it under D, shooting, D6, shutter type. Boom. Selections use auto, where it chooses either the mechanical or the first curtain electronic shutter, depending on what it's trying to do. Or you can force it to electronic first curtain shutter. Oddly, you can't usually select the mechanical shutter mode. It doesn't work with some lenses. For instance, this lens, the 16-50, it grays it out. I don't know why, that's just the way it is. To get the electronic shutter mode, it's hidden. It's in the setup menu, totally different menu. You have to go over here to the setup menu, silent mode, which is code for the electronic shutter. And notice how it's easy to turn it on or off. Nowhere in the camera does it tell you that that's how to get to the electronic shutter. So I hope this video is making it worth your while watching, but that's it. For light metering, I never use anything other than the matrix meter. We select that here under metering. The only time anybody doesn't get a perfect exposure with this camera is when they try to get smart and use one of these old timer modes like center weighted or something. You have to know the zone system to use those, which is why Nikon invented matrix metering back in 1984, over 40 years ago, and that's the metering mode to use. To get to time exposures, where you just press the button once and the shutter will stay open all night until you tell it otherwise, you simply set longer and longer shutter speeds, pass bulb, and you'll get the time. Now you press the button, it's exposing, and it'll go all night like this. Sadly, it does not time off on the rear screen. You have to use your Apple Watch or whatever. Tap it again, it opens. That way you can make long exposures. You can make long exposures automatically timed out to 15 minutes if you enable that in the mode so you can have it time itself. To do that, you go into the custom settings menu, go to D7, and just click that on. And now, as you'll notice, when I was in manual shutter speeds here, you see it goes beyond 30 seconds. It only reads in seconds, so you have to figure that out. But 900 seconds is 15 minutes, and you are good to go. Probably best you read this, but I mentioned that I set my U1, U2, and U3 for different kinds of subject types. Go to my written review, and you can actually download my file I set U1 for general nature and landscape, U2 for photographs of people who are at least holding still or trying to hold still, and U3 for action, which is people running around and doing whatever. Essentially, you set the camera up however you want it, and then to save into one of those, you go to the wrench. And at the top of the menu, this is the tricky part. At the top of the menu where it says Save User Settings, you see how you can save them to U1, U2, or U3. This is quite different than at the bottom of the menu. Don't be confused. Where to save your settings to a card for posterity, the Save Load menu setting. Sorry, I didn't write this. Nikon did it. That's what's confusing. But by using Save User Settings, you can program the camera however you want, including autofocus modes and ISOs and all that stuff, as well as which of these 4 exposure modes you're going to use, and then program it so it'll instantly recall whenever you call up any of these modes. To change any of these, simply call it up like that, choose U2, change whatever you want, then resave it into U2. There's no way to have it automatically update as we can on Canon, so you have to manually do that. Also, too, when I entered in all my copyright, kenrockwell.com and so forth into the comments, those save and recall on this too. And so what I do is I program my U1, then I change the settings I want to make it into what I would use for U2, then I save it as U2. Then I change what I want again for U3 and save it into U3. It sounds like a lot of gobbledygook, but man, it saves me so much time when I'm out shooting, because if I'm photographing a landscape and suddenly something interesting runs by, I can just boom, as I'm pointing the camera and get that shot. I always use a UV filter. I don't use a cap. I just put this clear filter on, any UV filter. It takes 46 millimeters on this lens. And it always keeps the lens protected, just like an iPhone. And that's it. I usually talk pretty quickly because I get pretty excited here. Go to my written review at kenrockwell.com, and the links are all in the description. And that is where you can find this all written down sanely, in color, actually, color text to match the menus. And hopefully this will make a lot more sense. If you find this helpful, admittedly, I'm not a YouTuber. My biggest source of support is when you go to my website and use my links to all the recommended sources that I use to get my stuff, to get your stuff. That's what keeps me on the air here. And I really appreciate you guys have been doing that for decades. And you folks are wonderful. So thanks again for watching Ken Rockwell here on kenrockwell.tv and kenrockwell.com. I'll see you guys soon. I always use a UV filter. I don't use a cap. I just put this clear filter on, any UV filter. It takes 46 millimeters on this lens. And it always keeps the lens protected, just like an iPhone.